It's wild how decades-old historical events aren't just locked away in some dusty past. They're actively dictating modern global politics right now. Today, we're unpacking the modern history of Iran, a nation whose contemporary identity is completely tethered to a single, highly dramatic year, 1953. To understand why this history matters today, well, we just have to look at the news. Remember the recent talk of American intervention in Iran? Following U.S. strikes, Donald Trump posted on social media threatening to depose Iran's leader, asking why there wouldn't be a regime change. Now, while other U.S. officials quickly backpedaled and said they weren't actually seeking to overthrow the government, just the mere mention of that phrase, regime change, hits a deeply raw historical nerve for Iranians. It literally resurrects visceral memories of the last time America directly helped topple a government in Tehran.
So it begs the question, how does a single covert operation orchestrated more than 70 years ago still dictate the geopolitical reality of the Middle East today? Why does the rhetoric of 1953 still echo so incredibly loudly in the halls of power in both Washington and Tehran?
To answer that, here is our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at the 1953 turning point. Then, the Shah's flawed ambitions. Third, the 1979 breaking point. And finally, we'll wrap up with the enduring legacy today.
All right, let's dive into part one, the 1953 turning point, a catalyst for chaos.
Let's set the scene. It's 1951, and a nationalist named Mohammad Mossadegh is elected as Iran's prime minister. His very first major move, he nationalizes the Iranian oil industry, effectively ripping it right out of British hands. Naturally, the British were furious. They were completely shut out of their most lucrative asset, so they leaned heavily on the United States for help. Now, keep in mind, this is the absolute height of the Cold War. Washington was terrified that Mossadegh might start leaning toward the Soviet Union. So what happens? In August 1953, the CIA and Britain's MI6 orchestrate Operation Ajax. And guys, this wasn't just some quiet diplomatic maneuvering. The CIA literally bribed local newspaper editors to run anti-Mossadegh propaganda. They even hired street gangs to stage these violent fake pro-Shah riots just to destabilize the capital. Ultimately, the legally elected Mossadegh was overthrown, placed under house arrest, and the reigning monarch, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, had his absolute power fully restored.
Now, this wasn't just a minor political reshuffle. It was a complete psychological earthquake. Journalist Stephen Kinzer describes the 1953 coup as a, quote, great trauma for Iran, the Middle East, and the colonial world. You see, this marked the very first time the United States had successfully overthrown a foreign government. It fundamentally and permanently altered how millions of people across the region perceived America. Almost overnight, the U.S. went from being seen as this benign democratic ideal to being viewed as an imperial meddler. Moving right along to part two, the Shah's flawed ambitions and modernization at a cost.
Over the next couple of decades, a stark, massive contrast emerged between the Shah's grand vision and the public's actual reality. The Shah, heavily backed by American aid and surging oil wealth, wanted to rapidly transform Iran into a modern, industrialized military superpower. He launched what he called the White Revolution, aiming for aggressive, Western-style modernization, massive land reforms, and sweeping infrastructure projects. But the reality on the ground for everyday Iranians? Vastly different. They were experiencing a regime plagued by major corruption scandals, deep systemic inequality, and policies that genuinely felt like a direct assault on their traditional Islamic values. The wealth simply was not trickling down to the masses. So a massive pressure cooker is basically building in Iran, fueled by three main pillars of the Shah's failure. First up, brutal suppression. The Shah's secret police, the Savak, heavily monitored, imprisoned, and tortured political dissidents, creating an atmosphere of just absolute widespread fear. Second, severe economic inequality. All that rapid economic development, it primarily benefited the political and business elite, leaving the urban poor struggling just to survive. And third, he fundamentally alienated the powerful religious clergy. His aggressive social reforms were deeply resented by traditionalists, which pushed incredibly influential religious leaders firmly into the opposition camp. To put a hard number on that intense economic frustration, think about this. 15%. Despite a massive surge in global oil revenues in the 1970s, severe economic mismanagement meant that domestic production just couldn't keep up with demand. The result of that?
Inflation averaged a crushing 15% annually between 1973 and 1978. This completely eroded the purchasing power of ordinary citizens. It entirely alienated the middle class, the students, and the intellectuals, the very people who might have otherwise actually supported his modernization efforts. Which brings us to part 3, the 1979 breaking point. A nation revolts.
The Shah's ultimate mistake was uniting incredibly diverse, opposing factions totally against him. He exiled outspoken critics, most notably Ayatollah Khomeini. But here's the thing, exiling Khomeini inadvertently skyrocketed his influence. From abroad, Khomeini's messages were smuggled in on cassette tapes, inspiring millions of people. Soon, exiled clerics, disillusioned secular intellectuals, and struggling workers, groups that historically had absolutely nothing in common ideologically, all united under one single goal, ending the Pahlavi monarchy completely. Mass protests and widespread labor strikes paralyzed the entire country in what quickly became the very first televised revolution in modern history.
As the unrest grew, the Shah found himself incredibly isolated. International criticism mounted over his human rights abuses. Interestingly enough, looking back at the collapse, former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger attributed the Shah's loss of power, in part, to the emasculation of the CIA. You see, following the Watergate scandal and the end of the Vietnam War, sweeping shifts in U.S. policy led to a massive scaling back of covert intelligence operations. This effectively left Washington totally blind to the reality on the ground in Iran, lacking the robust intelligence network that had kept the Shah secure in previous decades. Ultimately, in February 1979, the monarchy fell. The Islamic Republic was born, branding America as the Great Satan and eventually taking dozens of American diplomats hostage.
And finally, part 4, the enduring legacy today, or the ghosts of 53. Today, the historical figure of Mossadegh is this highly elastic symbol in Iran, constantly weaponized by totally opposing factions to fit their own contemporary agendas. It's fascinating. The reformist camp views Mossadegh as the ultimate symbol of democracy, the rule of law, and national liberation. To them, he represents a tragically lost era of political freedom. Conversely, the conservative, hardline view uses Mossadegh as a strict cautionary tale. To them, his downfall is absolute proof that you can never, ever trust the West, and they heavily criticize him for sidelining the religious establishment during his brief rule. And his image, it remains incredibly ubiquitous. Across contemporary Iranian magazine covers today, Mossadegh's face is deployed constantly. Depending entirely on the publication's political leaning, his image is used to advocate for standing up to foreign powers or pushing for domestic democratic reforms or warning against the dangers of Western alliances. His memory isn't just a piece of history, it is a living, breathing political tool. Let's look at a really concrete modern example. During the intense negotiations for the 2015 JCPOA nuclear deal, reformist media and supporters actually coined the slogan, "Zarif is the Mossadegh of our era," referring to Iran's chief nuclear negotiator, Mohammad Javad Zarif. They were drawing a direct, powerful analogy. They were saying, just as Mossadegh fought for Iran's sovereign right to its oil in the 1950s, Zarif was fighting for Iran's sovereign right to a peaceful nuclear program today. It was a way of framing the deal as a massive, triumphant reclaiming of national independence. This single historical event is invoked in an astonishing variety of ways. During the massive 2009 Green Movement protests, reformers directly compared the house arrest of opposition leader Mir Hossein Mousavi to the historical house arrest of Mossadegh. On the flip side, some fringe political voices even compared conservative populist Mahmoud Ahmadinejad to Mossadegh simply because both leaned heavily on anti-elite nationalist rhetoric. And remember when the U.S. eventually withdrew from that 2015 nuclear deal? Hardliners immediately seized on the ghosts of 1953. They launched the hashtag #UnreliableUSA to prove to the public that America will always eventually betray Iran just exactly like they did during Operation Ajax. Which leaves us with a final, vital thought. The events of 1953 are not just textbook history. They are the active vocabulary of modern geopolitics in the Middle East. Whether it's a social media post from a U.S. president talking about regime change, or Iranian factions battling over a nuclear deal, the legacy of Mossadegh is always present. It really forces us to ask, as long as the shadows of past interventions linger so heavily over the present, can the Middle East ever truly chart a new, unburdened path toward democracy? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this structured look at the past helps you better understand the headlines of today.